So I just want to thank everyone for joining and for registering, and welcome everybody on behalf of the Cambridge University Bahá'í Society. This is the third of 8 talks by 8 international speakers. Your microphones have all been switched off and your cameras are off as well for the duration. My name is Catherine. I'm a member of the Cambridge Bahá'í community, and in collaboration with the Cambridge University Bahá'í Society, these 8 talks have been organised to commemorate the centenary of the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá, which is on the 27th of November. Maybe you have joined because you were intrigued to understand who Abdu'l-Bahá is, or maybe it was the topic of the talk itself that intrigued you. For others, you may wish to just gain a greater understanding. So I would just like to share a few things about Abdu'l-Bahá. After the passing of his father, Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, Abdu'l-Bahá devoted his ministry to furthering his father's faith and to promoting the ideals of peace and unity. As well as being a prisoner for over 40 years for his teachings, he was also knighted by the British for his humanitarian work during the First World War. I'm simplifying his life, his significance and achievements, not only to the new religion, but also his significance to us today and the world today, hence these 8 talks. Each speaker, as an academic, has researched their interest in the work, teachings and life of Abdu'l-Bahá, and the talks cover a real diversity of subjects. I'm personally grateful for the time each speaker is giving to share their work from their corner of the world. The talk will be approximately 45 minutes long. There will be some time at the end to answer your questions. Please use the chat to write your question. All talks are being recorded and shared on the Bahá'í Society YouTube channel. Any questions after the talk, you can email the Bahá'í Society, and this email address will be provided on the final slide. After the talk, a few days later, you will receive a follow-up email with a list of the talks. You are very welcome to share this list, and please register yourself for the future talks. We believe this really is a unique opportunity. Also, the email address will also appear in that email in case you have further questions. I would now like to welcome our speaker, Holly Hanson. Holly is talking to us from Haifa, Israel. Holly became interested in rural-urban relationships in her career teaching the history of agrarian change at Mount Holyoke, a university in the United States. Uganda has been the subject of Holly's research, but she taught a class, The Once and Future Family Farm, which was about the transformation of small-scale agriculture and around the world in the last 3 centuries. Holly retired a year ago and is now a volunteer at the Bahá'í World Centre in Haifa, Israel. And Holly has provided some notes and references which we can share in the email that we send out after the talk. So there will be some references there for you to look at afterwards. So I hand over to you now, Holly.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the Cambridge University Bahá'í Society for inviting me to do this. I remember attending a meeting of the Society in 1998 and have very much enjoyed my opportunities to do research in Cambridge over the years. So I wish I was with you in person, but I'm glad to be here this way. What I want to do tonight is first explain why I have chosen this topic as something to think about for the 100th anniversary of Abdu'l-Bahá's passing. Then I want to share what Abdu'l-Bahá said about reciprocity. Then I want to think about the history of agriculture around the world in one particular moment in the 19th century when Abdu'l-Bahá was alive. And then I want to take the possibility of Abdu'l-Bahá's ideas about reciprocity and how they could be expressed in rural-urban relationships in the present and in the future as the last thing I want to dwell on. I'm a little bit afraid that this is not a 40-minute talk. It's more like a full-term course. So I'm going to be very, very deliberate with myself about timing the different segments and making myself stop and go on to the next. If I'm talking about redefining rural-urban relationships, then obviously we have to start with what is the definition of those now so that we could think about redefining them. And to ground us in how rural-urban relationships are in the present, I want to tell a story about beginning to teach a class. So I was at an event at the history department of Mount Holyoke College, and it had been announced that I was about to teach a new class called Rural Prosperity in the African Past. And a few students came up to me and they said, "What does that mean? What do you mean, rural prosperity?" And I said to them, well, that's the point of the class. If rural and prosperity seem to be words that so much don't go together that you're asking me, what does it mean? What does it mean, rural prosperity? That shows a kind of habit of thought and an acceptance on our part of a characteristic of the world, which I really think shouldn't be natural. I think the origin of the idea that cities are prosperous and rural areas are not, we could think of multiple origins for that. One is a notion that wealth is generated in cities because people are concentrated together and therefore wealth can happen. And so cities have always been prosperous and rural areas have always been poor. Another way that some people sometimes explain this is to say that wealth is created when human beings maximize human labor by using machines. And therefore, in the places in an economy where machine labor is combined with human labor, the results will be less, there'll be less wealth created than when more machines are used. Both of those are ways of thinking that make urban wealth and rural lack of wealth inevitable. And it's that I really want to question. It's really clear from the way the world is right now that whatever the origins, what we have isn't working. In some countries, we can see that a rural-urban divide, which is also a wealth and less wealth divide, makes societies ungovernable. That's kind of happening in the United States. Maybe in the last year or two, we've seen it in France, we've seen it in other countries. And when we look at south-north migration, what we see is people who might prefer to live as rural people in their own countries if rural life was viable, but it's not, which is causing this crisis of migration, which actually has its origins perhaps in the disequilibrium in the relationship of rural and urban. So that's why I want to think about and redefine rural-urban relationships. I think what we have is not natural. It's not inevitable. We've made it with 150, maybe 250 years of human choices, and we really need to rethink it. So as Catherine said, Abdu'l-Bahá was the son of Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith. Abdu'l-Bahá was born in 1844. He died in 1921. He was 67 years old when he traveled to England and to France to represent his father's faith to another part of the world. And when he traveled to England, people were fascinated. The newspaper coverage was phenomenal. The leading thinkers of Europe and of the United States and Canada when he was there made an effort to meet him. And now that it's the 100th anniversary of his passing, people who have had the opportunity to come across the figure of Abdu'l-Bahá, we're trying to understand his words and trying to understand how to value his words. And the part of the reason I chose this topic is because I think when we look at what Abdu'l-Bahá said specifically about rural prosperity, it really challenges us to think deeply about how do we understand Abdu'l-Bahá. And I'll loop back to that point at the end of the talk. So now let me tell you what Abdu'l-Bahá said about reciprocity. And I thought about how to do this. I thought, should I tell the history of agriculture first and then talk about what Abdu'l-Bahá said about reciprocity? But I decided to do it this way because I want you to keep in your minds the claims Abdu'l-Bahá makes about the reciprocal nature of reality as we start to think about the history of agrarian change that we're going to look at. I'm going to read you about 4 paragraphs, which is a lot of reading, but I really want us to frame what we're thinking about with Abdu'l-Bahā's words. So bear with me as I read. This is part of a letter that Abdu'l-Bahá wrote explaining a Baha'i practice, which is a form of it's a little bit like zakat in Islam. It's a form of collective responsibility for the welfare of the whole, not through a tax, but through a form of voluntary giving. And this is what he wrote. We're one to observe with an eye that discovereth the realities of all things. It would become clear that the greatest relationship that bindeth the world of being together lieth in the range of created things themselves, and that cooperation, mutual aid, and reciprocity are essential characteristics in the unified body of the world of being. Inasmuch as all created things are closely related together, and each is influenced by the other, or deriveth benefit therefrom, either directly or indirectly. So Abdu'l-Bahá is making a normative statement. He's describing reality. He's not saying the world would be a better place if there was reciprocity. He's actually in this statement that I'm not going to read all of, but I have put more of it in the notes. He talks, basically he explains the principles of, he lays out the principles of ecology, because he says in nature, everything is interdependent. And if you go from nature into human reality, we also see this interdependence. So all created things are closely related together, and each is influenced by the other or deriveth benefit therefrom, either directly or indirectly. And then he takes that into the human realm. And he says it's even more true in the realm of human beings, because there it applies to all conditions, whether physical or spiritual, such as those related to minds, thoughts, opinions, manners, customs, attitudes, understandings, feelings, or other human susceptibilities. In all these, thou should find these binding relationships, that's relationships of reciprocity and interdependence, securely established. And then he says, where human beings achieve interdependence and reciprocity, that's where human societies flourish. And if human beings don't achieve it, indeed, without these vital ties, it would be wholly impossible for the world of humanity to attain true felicity and success. So basically, Abdu'l-Bahá is describing reality, and he says, in reality, things are interdependent. he takes that insight and expands on it in the realm of social policy in a talk that he gave in Montreal in 1912. So after Abdu'l-Bahá visited France and visited England, he traveled to the United States and traveled across the United States and then back across the United States in 1912. And one of the talks he gave was in Montreal. And in that talk, he compares human society to the human body. And he says, in the body politic of society, just as in the human body, all of the parts are deeply dependent on all the other parts. If one member is in distress or is afflicted with some disease, all the other members must necessarily suffer. For example, a member of the human organism is the eye. If the eye should be affected, that affliction will affect the whole nervous system. Hence, if a member of the body politic becomes afflicted, in reality, from the standpoint of sympathetic connection, all will share that affliction, since this one afflicted is a member of the group of members, a part of the whole. And then he expands on that, and he imagines a family in which people recognize that they're members of a family, but not all of the members of the family are in the same condition. Although the body politic is one family, yet because of lack of harmonious relations, some members are comfortable and some in direst misery. Some members are satisfied and some are hungry. Some members are clothed in most costly garments, and some families are in need of food and shelter. Why? Because this family lacks the necessary reciprocity and symmetry. This household is not well arranged. The household is not living under a perfect law. Let's keep in mind that in 1912, the world had the highest degree of inequality that it had ever had up until that moment of time. And over the course of the 20th century, that went down until the 1970s, and now we're moving back up towards the degree of inequality that there was right before World War I. So he goes on and he imagines what people are thinking in this family. He says, is it possible for one member of a family to be subjected to the utmost misery and to abject poverty, and for the rest of the family to be comfortable? It is impossible unless those members of the family be senseless, atrophied, inhospitable, unkind. Then they would say, though these members do belong to our family, let them alone. Let us look after ourselves. Let them die. So long as I'm comfortable, I'm honored, I'm happy. This, my brother, let him die. If he's in misery, let him remain in misery, so long as I'm comfortable. If he's hungry, let him remain so. I'm satisfied. If he's without clothes, so long as I'm clothed, let him remain as he is. If he is shelterless, homeless, so long as I have a home, let him remain in the wilderness. I just read all of that part of the speech because I find it so interesting that Abdu'l-Bahá, with an audience in Montreal, he took them all the way there to imagine what's going on in people's minds if it's okay to them that other people are suffering. And although Abdu'l-Bahá is speaking rhetorically, if we think about villagers in some parts of the world and urban dwellers in other parts of the world, he's actually speaking about the present that we have. I mean, even he is. That let them die is not so far from the world that we have rationalized for ourselves. And he goes on to give a solution to the problem. He says, the solution, he says, is first and foremost is the principle that to all the members of the body politic shall be given the greatest achievements of the world of humanity. Each one shall have the utmost welfare and well-being. To solve this, then he says, to solve this problem, we must begin with the farmer. There we will lay a foundation for system and order, because the peasant class and the agricultural class exceed other classes in the importance of their service. And then he goes on to describe a system of progressive taxation, a very rigorous system of progressive taxation. And he says, through a policy what's interesting about this system of progressive taxation is it happens in the village. It doesn't happen, it happens at the very smallest level of society. And then he says, and if there's money left over, let it go to the federal government. So we might call it progressive taxation, but it imagines that the fundamental decision-making unit is not large. It's very small, and in that unit, people actually know each other. And then he concludes, God is not partial and is no respecter of persons. He has made provision for all. The harvest comes forth for everyone. The rain showers upon everybody, and the heat of the sun is destined to warm everyone. Therefore, there should be for all humanity the utmost happiness, the utmost comfort, the utmost well-being. So that's what Abdu'l-Bahá says. That is Abdu'l-Bahā's view of reciprocity. First, that it is present in physical and biological reality, and it needs to be present in human reality. So what do we make of Abdu'l-Bahā's statements? We could say, yep, cooperation. Cooperatives were very, very popular from the 1840s to the 1890s, but they didn't work that well. Now we have co-op stores. It's nice to remember that, but the world has moved on. Or we might say, Abdu'l-Bahá is describing a potential which humanity could reach if we try, but it will be hard. But maybe we're underestimating human potential. Maybe we could actually do it. But that part about the farmer comes first was him just speaking in his time, because now the world is industrialized and the IT industry comes first. So we could take Abdu'l-Bahá seriously, but put it in a historical context. Or we might say, Abdu'l-Bahá is describing a human reality, a potential we need to reach toward to actually be who we can be as human beings. But it's really hard for me to imagine, because what would it mean for farmers to come first? Our experience of reality is that farmers really don't matter that much. If, as it is true in the United States, 96% of the onions that are eaten in the United States are grown on 6 farms in California, and they don't really even have that many employees because it's all mechanized. Who's the farmer? How can the farmer come first? There aren't any farmers anymore. Okay, so now let's think about the global history of agriculture, because I think thinking about the history can help us figure out what Abdu'l-Bahá means and what he was actually saying to that audience in Montreal 110 years ago. So in order to make this story fit into a talk instead of a term, what I'm going to do is take a look at a few places around the world in the 19th century, mostly the second half of the 19th century, and use each specific place to exemplify a process that was happening elsewhere. I'm going to talk about terms of trade for rural and urban products and how the terms of trade changed, using a story of the market bell and market protest in England. I'm going to talk about the consequences of new forms of long-distance trade in food in the story of grain leaving India in the 1880s. And I'm going to talk about the consequences of fertilizer by telling you about guano mining in South America at the same period in time. And with each story, what I want us to do is to think about Abdu'l-Bahá's perspective that cooperation and reciprocity are the source of well-being. And without reciprocity, human societies can't flourish. Okay, newsflash. People in cities need to eat. They do. We do. Therefore, the idea that cities have always been prosperous and rural areas have always been poor isn't very historically grounded, because up until the very recent past, maybe certainly not more than 200 years ago, cities needed rural people more than rural people needed cities. Also, the relationship of food producers to food consumers was a very local relationship because food is heavy. And so the transportation of food over long distances except for by rivers. So the transportation of food over long distances by land really only happened once we had the Industrial Revolution. Because before that, the cost of moving food over land took up more good, it cost more than it was worth. So if we look over the long term, the relationship of cities to their hinterlands where their food is coming from, it can't be an exploitative one, because the people in the cities need the food that the people in the rural areas are going to get to them. And what we can see in the late 18th and the very late 18th and the beginning of the 19th century in England is we can see an erosion of a sense of mutual responsibility, which is happening because of the enlargement of food markets before industrialization happened. But the sense that the economic system and the marketing system has to work in a way that is fair to farmers can be seen in the rules that existed in England. For example, in the markets where agricultural produce is sold, there was a market bell, and the market bell rings to say that the market is open, and now you can sell, and now you can buy. And you couldn't sell before that. And also people couldn't sell agricultural produce in the field. The markets, and you sometimes still see this word, they were called pitching markets because the producer had to harvest the crop, bring it to market, pitch it into the market, and then the person who was going to buy had to buy in the market. Why? because the market bell rings. For the first hour, anyone could buy any amount, any small amount that they wanted. The farmer couldn't say, I'm only going to sell to you if you're going to buy this very large amount. The practice, the law was, even small people, even poor people have the right to buy food. And the law that you can't sell your crop standing in the field also protected farmers because it made the entire exchange visible to everybody. When that began to change, when people began to sell crops from the field, even though they weren't supposed to, and when farmers began to, traders began to take food from rural areas and move it to sell it in London rather than it being exchanged in a local market, farmers were losing out, and also middle-income people were losing out. And the way that people protested was to stop the wagons and then to sell the food. They didn't stop the wagons and steal the food. They stopped the wagons and then sold the food to each other at what they thought was a just price, gave the carter the money, and that was their protest. So what people were saying was, we're part of a system. The rules that we had ensured that we would get seen in this system, and let's not lose it. So there's a lot more to that story, but we have to move on to another part of the world. The first really big shakeup in terms of the terms of trade for rural areas is the power of steam, because railroads can move food, and then food becomes a commodity, then it becomes a subject of speculation. And once people are speculating about food, it's possible for farmers to be left out. There's a really wonderful book about this called Late Victorian Holocaust, in which Mike Davis describes famines that happen around the world when there's a severe El Nino famine in the 1880s, a severe El Nino event. So there's drought in different parts of the world. But what Mike Davis shows is the last 200 years earlier, when there had been a severe El Nino drought, El Nino event, and then there was drought, people hadn't starved in the same way. And the reason that they hadn't was the size of food markets. That there, in earlier centuries, there wasn't a global market in food. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to tell you more about this. You can ask me if you want. But in India, as this is happening, grain is being exported by railroad from India because other people can pay a higher price for it than people can in India during this drought. People wouldn't have, the death during that drought would not have been severe if railroads hadn't existed to take the grain out. But it wasn't the railroads that caused the famine. What caused the famine was railroads in the absence of an acknowledgement of reciprocity. Okay, we could talk about that more later. Another really key element in the transformation of agriculture is what's called the metabolic rift. So metabolic as in metabolism, and rift as in like a really profound break. And what the metabolic rift means is man-nature reciprocity, which had been part of basically all agricultural systems around the world, had systems of reciprocity where human beings, through their agricultural effort, the land produced food for the human beings, and then the human beings in that agricultural process nourished the land. So in some places we're familiar with this because farmers tilled the land, they used cattle, the cattle produced manure, the manure enriched the soil. There are much more complicated ones in some parts of the world. The man-nature reciprocity includes ash. They're very, very complex reciprocities. But in the late 19th century, partly because of the steam engine and because of the expansion of agricultural markets and, for example, grain being moved from the Western United States across the United States by railroad, then across the ocean by steamship, farmers could no longer keep up. They couldn't keep up their soil with man-nature reciprocities because they wanted to use their soils too intensely. And so people turned to artificial fertilizers. And the first one they turned to was mining guano from South America. And then after the guano was gone, we got into artificial fertilizers. So there's this period of a few decades when the agriculture of the United States is supported by natural fertilizer, which comes from bird poop from South America, that's being mined by indentured Filipino laborers, just working on these rocks at the very bottom of South America. What this did for the farmers, it was the end of the guano rocks, but who cares about that? I mean, I don't think anybody really minded that the guano wasn't on the rocks anymore. But what it did for the farmers is over time, it deprived farm families of independence and control. Although the recognition of that came slowly in some places, came faster in others. Okay. We've looked at 3 moments of change in agriculture in the 19th century. But those same processes continue into the 20th. So maybe the next really big step in the transformation of agriculture is the process of industrialization of agriculture, which really happens around World War II. And then after that, an intensification of agricultural inputs that happens from the 1970s onward. And those processes, as well as the ones I talked about for the 19th century, where am I? We can see a loss of reciprocity, not on 4 levels. One is human nature reciprocity. Another is reciprocity in terms of the members of the farm household working together. Another is the relationship of individuals and institutions and communities. And we could see that in England, and wherever you look at 20th century agriculture and look at the level of community and social policy, we can see this fraying of reciprocity. So we see that in these stories that I've told, and in this process over more time where we could tell more stories, we see the city benefiting from the country. We don't see the country benefiting from the city. We don't see the land benefiting from the farm. And as that happened, we didn't change the way we did agriculture. We didn't see it and then change the way we did agriculture. We saw it and changed the way we thought about it. So the idea that interdependence, the notion of interdependence is traditional, or the notion that interdependence is utopian, or the notion that cities have always been wealthy and rural areas have always been poor. We have habits of thought that make sense that urban areas are prosperous and rural areas are not. But if we look again at what Abdu'l-Bahá said, where we began, was the human world. In the human world thou beholdest this wondrous phenomena, shining resplendent from all sides with the utmost perfection. Inasmuch as in this station, the human station, acts of cooperation, mutual assistance, and reciprocity are not confined to the body and to things that pertain to the material world, but for all conditions, whether physical or spiritual, such as those related to minds, thoughts, opinions, manners, customs, attitudes, understandings, feelings, or other human susceptibilities. In all these things thou shouldst find these binding relationships securely established. Okay, so I already talked about 4 dimensions. And what I want to do now is think about those 4 kinds of reciprocities: man and nature, inside the family, the farm and the community, and the community and the world, or the farm community and the world community, and ask, is it possible that those could be reestablished, and what would it take? What kinds of processes of learning would we have to put in place in order to develop the capacities? What process of learning would we have to put in place to develop the capacity to recreate reciprocity in all of those levels? And I think it's a hard question, but I don't think it's an impossible question. I want to give you 2 examples. One is a dairy farm in the community next to a dairy farm about 5 miles from my old house. And I think farms like Barstow's farm show that our simple habits of thought are flawed, because it's not technology that is keeping us from having prosperous rural communities. It's how we do it. So on Barstow's farm, which is a family farm, they have recreated a man-nature reciprocity by having a really gigantic biodigester. It's kind of like a great big mechanical cow's stomach. It takes all their manure and a lot of food waste from the area and produces power with it. So they power their own farm, all of the households of their farm and the town around them, the village around them, with power from their digester. Because they have they used a local policy which funds farms to keep land as agricultural land. They used the money they got from that to put in a very, very fancy milking parlor so that the cows go and they can get attached to a milker by themselves, so that the members of the family don't have to get up every morning and milk cows for a few hours and milk cows for a few hours again in the evening, which brought the fourth generation back to the farm. It also made the cows healthier. But the other thing I wanted to say about this farm is that they have somebody in the fourth generation wanted to have a dairy, a little a bakery. So on their farm, they have created this space where people from the community around them show up and engage with them in conversation, so that on the space of their farm, they're on a human level creating ties between the nearby urban community and the rural community. I have 2 minutes. I want to give you one more example. Oh, the last thing about Barstows. When they have public events, people ask, what can we do to support you? And the farm educator always says, drink milk and buy local. So small-scale agriculture requires people to see it, pay attention to it, and connect to it. The other example that I was going to give, but I think I'll stop, is was agricultural marketing in Uganda. And in Uganda, there's and many cities around the world, there's a problem of well-educated but underemployed urban youth. And there's also a problem of agricultural marketing, which really doesn't work for the farmer. The farmers do not get the full value of their crops because they are beholden to agricultural marketers. So what if people in urban areas understood themselves as being engaged in a reciprocal relationship with rural people and asked about their food, not how cheap is my food, but how can I engage in purchasing food to eat in a way that supports and enriches a rural community. And that realm of action is only one of the realms in which the kinds of the possibilities laid out by Abdu'l-Bahá were not just the attitudes of individuals. It was the attitudes of individuals, the actions of individuals, the spaces in community, the social policy of community, and the structures of global governance. But the realm of action of the individual is really immense. And because we all eat, the realm of the action of the individual in an urban area is really very large. Okay, let me conclude. I want to go back to the question, how do we understand Abdu'l-Bahá? Is his statement about rural prosperity and how it could be achieved, is it a heartwarming story of a more innocent time? Is he telling us, change your values, make urban-based civilization more responsible? Or is he saying, you really have to rethink it all? You took some wrong steps in making the modern world, and you're going to have to really do it differently. I don't think we know the answer to that question. I think it's a really hard question. And I think we should let it be a hard question. And just for comparison, what if Jesus had a son, and Jesus' son had represented his father to the world, and we had lived in that time? How would we have heard him? How would we have placed ourselves in time in relation to him? Because I think if we ask ourselves, what did Abdu'l-Bahá mean when he said the farmer comes first? I think it's really a question about how do we place ourselves in time. When we encounter Abdu'l-Bahá's words, we're recognizing ourselves in a world-shaping moment, something that happens only periodically, when a messenger of God shows up and seeds a civilization in the way that God speaks. And we have to plant ourselves in the world, that this is the world that I'm in. These are the conditions of the world that I'm in. And I have to understand it, and I have to see a sequence of actions that I can take, and then people following me can take, and imagine the consequences of those actions. But at the same time, as I'm trying to really see myself in the world, I think I have to be aware that it's beyond me to understand it. And that the way that I see the world includes a rationalization of the many ways that we've gone wrong. So at this moment in time, thinking about Abdu'l-Bahá, I guess where I want to end with is it's really a gift to have the thought of someone whose thought is so much bigger than our own. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Holly, and thank you for, I'm sure it was very difficult to summarize your own research and your own teaching over the years and into such a short period, but very, very interesting indeed. I feel like I've been given a lot to think about, and even a new language and a frame to look at what's going on in the world at the moment. We haven't actually got any questions in the chat at the moment, so I'll just say that everybody will receive an email after this talk in a few days, and it will include the link to the YouTube channel for the Baha'i Society. It will include the list of all the talks, and also an email address. If you have any questions or comments that you wish to share, you can use that email address. Without the questions being there, if there's anything else, Holly, you want to add that maybe you thought you didn't have time to, I'm sure it will be fine in the last few minutes. Do you have anything else?
Yeah, I'll give you my Uganda example. So I can remember driving from Western Uganda back to the city of Kampala, And there's a certain point in Western Uganda where you start to smell onions. The whole area smells like onions because farmers have grown onions and they've put them in 50-pound gunny sacks and carried them to the side of the highway, a long distance to the side of the highway. And people are standing by the side of the highway with gunny sacks of onions, hoping that a truck driver will stop and buy the onions from them and carry them into the market, because maybe they'll get a higher price from the random truck driver who's trying to make a little money than they will get from the agricultural marketers. And I remember driving back across the country. It's only 5 hours, but if you don't have, as most farmers don't, you don't have a vehicle, and you can't do the marketing yourself. So I was fantasizing about how if I was really rich, then I would buy a boat and I would hire someone to buy food in Western Uganda and carry it to the capital and give the profit back to farmers in the West. Then a few years later, I was visiting, and some young friends of mine, some 30-something young adults who had they had noticed that in the course, the work that they were doing with early adolescents and teenagers, that young people would finish school and there wasn't work for them. So my friends decided to try to create a company where they would purchase agricultural products and then have people process them into, things like potato chips, snacks, and sell them to grocery stores. But what they found was the real barrier was in the level of policy. It was marketing rules which made it very difficult for them to do what they were doing. I see there's a question, so I'll stop talking about Uganda.
Oh, thank you. Yes, there's from Oliver, is there anything we can learn from pre-colonial African societies about sustainable agriculture?
Yes, a lot. One of the things that, there's so much. So one of the really interesting things about African agriculture is that Africa was a net food exporter until the 1950s. So that's from pre-colonial into colonial. There are, one of the things about African agriculture, which is different from Europe, is the carrying capacity of land was different. So African agricultural systems were pretty much from the Sahara on down, were organized in a way to maximize the collection of people to work together in very, very short critical moments of time. So there are very many forms of systematic collaboration in African agriculture. There's also tremendous diversity. So a farmer in the mountains of Tanzania with maybe a half-acre plot in the past, in the pre-colonial past, would have been growing 60 different crops on that very, very small plot. Then another thing that I think is important to see in African agriculture is systematic experimentation. So we know from historical linguistics that there's a word for experimental garden. So people were growing crops, but next to the house there was a little garden, which was the experimental garden. So we can see community level generation of knowledge from a long time ago.
Thank you. I think that that answers the question nicely, and it brings us to an end. And I have a feeling that after this, I'm going to be on Google looking up some of these concepts and communities which you've brought to our attention. So thank you on behalf of everybody. I wish we could hear a round of applause, but we'll just have to imagine it. Thank you for your time, Holly. And like I said, everybody will be receiving an email with the remaining talks. Please feel free to share them and sign up for them. And there's the slide with the information as well. So I'm wishing you all a lovely weekend and hopefully see you next time. Thank you.